Financial Argument. Follow us on YouTube.
Hi, Dave. Good to be with you.
Hey, thanks for being on here again. And you're out there on ground zero, where Deutsche Bank is. I wanted to talk about Deutsche Bank and what's been going on out there. Can you give us a summary of what you've been hearing, what's been going on, and what to look out for?
Sure. And people have to be very wary of the reports coming through the media on this, because the focus is very much on the $14 billion fine that the Justice Department levied against Deutsche Bank on mortgage-backed security fraud. Now, the important thing is that, of course, they committed mortgage-backed security fraud. Who didn't of the big banks? This is a very large fine, but that's not why Deutsche Bank is in trouble. They're in trouble because they have a portfolio heavily loaded with derivatives that are opaque. No one has any real idea, the so-called level 3 derivatives. No one has any idea what's in them and what value they have. They're also holding large amounts of bad debt, sovereign debt, corporate debt. They have a tremendous exposure to the Italian banks. They're facing fraud suits in Moscow and Italy. 2 top Deutsche Bank people in Italy were arrested the other day. I mean, what we're seeing is Deutsche Bank is sort of a poster child for the post-2008 too big to fail banks. And less people start saying, well, it's Germany, it's Europe. Look at Wells Fargo. Look at the situation with Citibank and Bank of America, which are also carrying huge derivative debt and are very much integrated with Deutsche Bank. So what we're really looking at is a potential for a domino effect systemic meltdown of the whole financial system, which could be triggered by a very large fine, but that's unlikely. It's more likely that there will be a problem with derivatives, which will bring up the whole question that we faced in 2008 with Lehman Brothers, which is, can you trust the valuations that these banks have been advertising when they sell their paper?
Why do you think at this point the DOJ, Department of Justice, decided to levy these fines going back to 2008? What was the whole purpose of this?
Well, that's a very good question, because why did they wait till now is one question. Why did they wait till now with Deutsche Bank is another question, because Deutsche Bank has been clearly in violation on virtually every single fraudulent issue that's been under scrutiny since 2008. I think there's some game playing going on, because remember, Volkswagen was just hit with a very large fine. I think there's a fear among some that Germany may break. And by break, I mean break from the euro, break from the sanctions regime against Russia. There was just a conference today in Berlin that I attended briefly of the German-Russian Chamber of Commerce, where the whole discussion of sanctions brought up very heated denunciations of the United States from the Russians and the Germans. So the fear is that if Germany breaks, then all of Europe could break from the transatlantic financial system. We've already seen a section of the British banking system break from that with the Brexit. So I think there's a real fear that you've got to do whatever possible to keep them under the thumb of the global banks. Now, whether Deutsche Bank is going to break, or be the straw that breaks the camel's back or not, I don't know, but it could be the downfall of Chancellor Merkel. And in a sense, that would be very good, because Merkel has been an errand boy for the City of London and Wall Street, totally subservient to Obama. And Germany is in the midst of a number of different crises, not the least of which is the refugee crisis, which is largely a result of U.S. geopolitical screw-ups in the Middle East.
Do you hear from maybe others out there that Germany wants to they want to get rid of the sanctions against Russia, and they want to resume trade with Russia because it's really hurting the economy? Do you hear anything about those type of talks out in Germany?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. As I said, the German-Russian Chamber of Commerce, but also what's called the Mittelstand, the medium-sized, small and medium enterprises in Germany, which really are the core of the development of new technologies and productivity that drives the German economy, the job creation of the German economy. It's mostly these small and medium enterprises. They're cut off from credit because of the banking crisis, and they're cut off from markets, not just with Russia, but they'd like to do a lot more with China as well. I just attended a major international transportation conference in Berlin, and I was talking to a very significant German diesel engine producer. And I asked him what they think about China, and he said, well, right now we're thinking very well about China. They just bought a major stake in our company. So the future for Europe is toward the east. Now, that doesn't mean it would exclude alliances with the United States, but the direction the United States is going is not the direction that will be beneficial for Europe. And I think we're also seeing a rebellion against the TTIP, the free trade agreement between the United States and Europe. The French are rejecting it. There were 300,000 people in the streets of Germany about 3 weeks ago on a Saturday demonstrating against it. The whole Anglo-American financial model is unraveling. Now, you may know there's an International Monetary Fund, World Bank annual meeting going on in Washington right now. Mm-hmm. And the IMF correctly identified their policies of quantitative easing and austerity as being a disaster. So what's their solution? More quantitative easing and figuring out some way to get some of that extra money they're pumping into the system into the real economy. Now, how are they going to do that when the banks need every ounce of liquidity they can get to back up their bad debt? And so this is why people in Germany are looking for a way out. This is why there's talk now of an Italian exit, an Austrian exit, a French exit. We're seeing, and not just from the euro, but from the whole transatlantic banking system.
From what you said right now, what it sounds like is that the United States government, the central bank, is putting pressure on Germany. They might be using this as a tactic to say, get back in line, or we will bring down Deutsche Bank and we'll bring down Germany and we'll destroy what you have right now. I mean, that's what it sounds like.
Well, and there is an element of that. Now, the Germans are playing their own game. Kryan, the CEO of Deutsche Bank, is in Washington right now. And according to the German press, he's playing a chicken game with the U.S. He's basically saying, if you don't reduce the fine, then you could be tipping the domino that will bring down your banking system. But you see, I think this is where you see the level of incompetence of these bankers. They, on some level, believe what Lagarde, the IMF director, said in opening the meeting yesterday. Lagarde said that the U.S. has the situation under control. If Europe did more along the lines of the U.S., we could bring Europe under control. And the biggest threat to the financial system is the people who are rebelling against the trade agreements and rebelling against the EU. In other words, she's got it backwards. Mm-hmm. She's saying that people are rebelling and causing the crisis, as opposed to recognizing that the rebellion, which is universal. I mean, this is what the 2016 election campaign in the U.S. showed, the absolute hostility of most of the population toward the establishment. People know there's something wrong, but they don't know how to deal with it. And what you see among the bankers is the arrogant belief that they can still control things from the top and that they can use the fear of a banking crisis to force the politicians in line. And I think people should be afraid of this banking crisis. I mean, you could have pension funds wiped out on a much larger scale than 2008. And this is something that LaRouche has been emphasizing for the last years, that people who think their pensions are safe have obviously forgotten what happened to their 401k in the fall of 2008. William White, the former chief economist for the Bank for International Settlements, told a gathering the other day that if we don't wipe out some of this uncollectible debt and take it off the books of banks, then governments or the depositors in these banks are going to be held liable for the losses, which means your deposit under a bail-in provision could be seized. That's in the Dodd-Frank bill. That's in the EU single banking resolution mechanism. So there's a desperation there, but they think that they can still control the game from the top. And what they don't realize is that at a certain point, the Germans the Germans have reached a point where their hypocrisy in the way they dealt with Greece and other debtor nations is now coming back to haunt them. Mm. They said that there can't be any more bailouts. Well, what happens if the German government is asked to bail out Deutsche Bank because of its systemic importance for Germany?
I mean, right now, I believe Merkel says there's no plans to bail out Deutsche Bank. We know there's the bail-in documents. Do you think they would head in that direction if things start to really break down, that they would try to bail in the bank? And if Deutsche Bank does go, how bad is this going to get? I mean, what type of chain reaction is this going to create?
Well, right off the bat, Commerzbank, which is the number 2 bank in Germany, would probably go under. The Italian banking system, which is barely hanging on now, would be gone. It would be vaporized. BNP Paribas, Societe Generale in France, Royal Bank of Scotland, the leading British banks, they're all interconnected. JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, they're all interconnected. Now, Merkel, under pressure, in an interview said they're not going to bail out Deutsche Bank. But what's going on, and I have this from very top sources in Germany, is that the German government is working on a plan B and a plan C. And they need 2 plans, because if they do bail out the bank, and by bailout I mean a government bailout, they're going to have some kind of plan to deal with the Italian and the French situation. Now, the other part of this is that you mentioned the bail-in, and we were talking about this before. Deutsche Bank would be foolish to start seizing deposits of its clients, which is what a bail-in is. And taking money from senior holders of their bonds and debt. Because if they did that, then nobody would trust Deutsche Bank. It would be the end of Deutsche Bank, and it would probably be the end of the banking system in Europe as we know it.
The IMF and the EU, I mean, from this point, it looks like they're trying to push new rules to get rid of bad loans on the banks, where the banks would just, write off the bad loans, which in their view would help the banking system. Have you heard anything about these new rules that they want to implement?
Well, this is another trick, because if they really wipe out the bad debt, it's going to trigger all kinds of counterparty agreements. And the clearinghouses put out a report recently that they couldn't handle the volume of write-off that's required. I mean, we're talking about writing off trillions of dollars of obligations. Now, that's what should happen. They should happen, and should be done in an orderly fashion through restoring Glass-Steagall, forcing banks to get rid of their speculative casino operations. And under those circumstances, then governments could protect the central core banking of depositors and banks making loans for real production. But if you're talking about what they are talking about now, of taking some of the bad debt and putting it in special investment vehicles or in bad banks, this is the Enron model from 2000. I mean, I don't know if people realize this, but Enron was advised by JP Morgan Chase and Citibank to create these things called special investment vehicles with the names like Chewbacca and things of that sort, where they created these debt modules, and they were given loans from banks to back them up. And then they started selling stock in them, or shares in them, not stock, but shares in them. And these things were just landing places of uncollectible debt. And after Enron collapsed, Greenspan made that legal. And that's part of the Commodities Futures Modernization Act that allowed companies to that have no business in commodities creating derivative contracts, banks, I should say, creating derivative contracts on holdings of copper and silver and things of that sort. So the whole system went haywire, and it started long before 2008. And the starting point for a return to sound banking principles is going back with Glass-Steagall.
So from your viewpoint, where is everything heading right now? What do you think the next step will be for the U.S. government, central bank, Germany, EU, IMF on this Deutsche Bank situation?
Well, I think we're seeing what is best described as heteronomy, people looking out for their own interests first. And we see this with J.P. Morgan coming out saying, look, we're in pretty good shape compared to Deutsche Bank. Commerzbank just did an ad saying, well, there is a good Deutsche Bank, German bank, referring to themselves, playing off the competition with Deutsche Bank. But Commerzbank is blowing a lot of hot air. The problem is that there is no simple bank-by-bank solution because it's a systemic crisis. And it goes back to the destruction of classical economic thinking. And by classical, I don't mean Adam Smith and the Austrian school. I mean the Hamiltonian national banking conception, which said that governments should be vehicles of credit to those responsible banks that will loan them to responsible clients who will invest in something that will produce physical wealth. And this is something that we've gotten away from since essentially the death of John F. Kennedy. And we've increasingly moved into placing values on financial instruments that have nothing underlying them. And this is why they say you have this opaqueness problem. Nobody knows what's in some of these derivatives. The over-the-counter derivatives have been thoroughly deregulated. And so the people who are writing them don't even know what's in them in some cases. And then to try to value them and count them in some way in the regulatory capital of a bank under Basel III or Basel IV agreements is absurd. And so you really have to break with this whole paradigm. And in the United States, that means virtually everything we've done since Nixon took the dollar off gold and ended the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate. Now, that may seem radical, but I believe it was even Lord Rothschild who said we're engaged in the most radical banking experiment in world history. Now, someone like him recognizes that this is foolishness. Who knows where he's putting his money? But I think the important point, Dave, is that people who are looking at this thing and saying, well, is this an intended collapse? Is this part of the super plan of the bankers? These bankers couldn't organize a 2-car funeral procession. They're incapable now of coming up with a policy option other than what will keep them in business for another week. And so, we're facing something which is inevitable. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to happen this week or next week or at the end of this quarter or the end of the fiscal year. It just means the system as it exists cannot continue much longer. And this is where the question of policy comes up. Don't expect some Treasury official or a Federal Reserve official or certainly a President Clinton or even a President Trump to come up with a solution. We've got to have a policy debate, a rip-roaring, vigorous debate in this country, in the United States and in Europe, over what the policy should be. And starting with a rejection of the axioms of the last 40 years, the whole free trade, deregulated axioms, which have underlain the greatest transfer of wealth in world history.
And this whole situation reminds me of 2008 with the subprime security. I know with the derivative market it's much, much worse, but with the subprime, they didn't even know what was inside these securities. They didn't know, what was going on. They actually had no clue. We know that S&P, Moody's, they were all just rating them AAA. And right. They kept the illusion going for a very long time. And it feels like they're doing the same thing once again, where they're keeping this illusion alive. They really don't, or they do know, and they're not telling anyone what's really going on with these derivatives, because they know it's like a time bomb, and eventually it will go off.
Well, I describe it as the Wile E. Coyote phenomenon, that the coyote's gone over the cliff, but until he looks down, he thinks he's doing pretty well. Yeah. And, this is where we are in this thing. The bank profits are up, the stock markets are soaring. You can get an idiot like Paul Krugman saying that the fundamentals in the U.S. are sound. And you even get someone like Bernie Sanders who accurately spoke about the wealth inequality, but then turned around and said Obama saved us from a catastrophe. So the most of the commentary is pure drivel. And if you speak with serious people in finance, they're astounded that it's lasted this long. And I mentioned before William White. He just gave a speech in Singapore, and he was asked, when do you think this will crash? And he said, I don't know. It may have already crashed, and we just don't know it yet. He said, but when we do find out, it's going to be something much larger than 2008. And that's because with quantitative easing, they're just creating a bigger pile of worthless debt. I saw the figure that in the last half year, central banks pumped almost, I think it was $600 billion in liquidity into the banking system. Now, that's not even including the guarantees and backups and other things they're doing. And this is money that's just sitting on the books of banks. That's there to, if they need it, to stop the bleeding when a derivative blows out.
You mentioned Obama, and today it came out that the Obama administration, they spent like billions on PR firms to convince the American people that the economy is doing very well. It's funny that they would have to spend the people's money to convince the people that the economy is doing well. I mean, if the economy is truly doing well, I don't think we need convincing, and I don't think we need to spend the money on that. The only reason I believe... Go ahead.
It's like the guy who is working 3 jobs and living in his brother-in-law's basement will be convinced by seeing someone in a 3-piece suit talking about the great economic recovery.
Right.
When the bill collector's at the door in the house, the car has just been repossessed. This is part of the fraud. It's the same fraud as Obama had following in Bush's footsteps, saying that we're conducting a war on terrorism, when in fact we're aiding the terrorists. In fact, even giving the terrorists weapons now. So, the looking glass war, or any one of the metaphors that you can use for what happens when a small group of people take power and take control and have no real blocks against them. The Congress is bought and sold. But the interesting thing I would add, though, going back to what I said earlier about a vigorous debate, we saw something that I think nobody would have expected, which is both the Democrats and the Republicans put a plank for Glass-Steagall in their platforms at their conventions. Now, on the Democratic side, Hillary Clinton did it despite most of her primary campaign talking against Glass-Steagall. Now she's also saying she's against the TPP. I don't think anybody can trust her as far as they can throw her. On the Republican side, there were people who had to fight to get the Glass-Steagall put in, but Trump himself intervened to make sure it stayed in the platform. Now, that doesn't mean that either of them could be trusted to do it, but there is a Glass-Steagall bill before the Congress. There's a lot of discussion going on in the Congress right now about, what's going to be the future, and the Deutsche Bank issue, and also the hearings they've had on Wells Fargo, where, and this, Dave, Wells Fargo is advertising itself as the clean bank.
Right.
And then you find out that people who barely have a nickel in their banks, the sudden bank account, suddenly discover they actually have 12 accounts.
It's funny because whenever the banks or corporations tell you how clean they are, how great they are, how they're doing it for the people, it always seems like it's the opposite of what's really happening.
Yeah, check your back pocket to see if your wallet's been lifted.
And it feels like it's a PR stunt, just like everything else. You mentioned terrorism. You mentioned what was going on in other places around the world. And we know that the economy and what is happening around the world is all interconnected. It's not just one without the other. And we mentioned this in other times that we spoke about Syria, about Libya, Lebanon. Now, Syria is a complete mess. Right now, it looks like Russia and the Syrian government, they're making a push to take back Aleppo. And I know Aleppo is a very strategic area, and the United States doesn't want to lose Aleppo. But what we're seeing right now is the U.S. is using a lot of propaganda because they're losing ground. Russia and the Syrian government, they're destroying the Islamic State. They're hitting al-Nusra. They're hitting al-Qaeda. I don't even think there are moderate rebels. I think they're just all terrorists.
Yeah.
I mean, what at this point, we know this is all also dependent on the petrodollar, because they wanted to get into Syria, maybe then go into Iran, control the Middle East, keep the petrodollar propped up. What happens now? Where the U.S. going to do at this point? Because they're not even supposed to be in Syria. I mean, they're in Syria, mapping out a piece of Syria, building bases. The French are building bases in a sovereign country.
The U.S. is there illegally in violation
Yes.
of international law. The Russians were invited in by the Syrian government. But you have this irony where you have a president who says that Assad should not be the leader of Syria. And as Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, asked, when did Obama get Syrian citizenship and a right to determine who the president is? Look, this is an extension of a geopolitical doctrine which goes back to the Project for a New American Century, the neocons who were responsible for the Iraq War, the Paul Wolfowitzes, the Rumsfeld, and others. And what was their view? Their view is that with the end of the Cold War, no country or bloc of countries can be allowed to challenge the dominance of the U.S. and its allies in using free markets as a source of loot to prop up their banking system. And so that's what the idea is. That's what Obama says about why the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, instead of the Chinese proposals, because he said we have to write the rules. This is a unipolar world asserting itself, and the Russians and the Chinese in particular had the gall to say, we don't want to go into your world. When Putin was asked, why don't you buy Euro bonds, Putin said, well, we don't eat other people's spoiled food. All it does is give us indigestion. And even with the sanctions and everything else being done against Russia, the Russian economy is in relatively good shape. They have very little debt. They're starting to revive a machine tool sector and an industrial capability. The Chinese economy, you keep hearing the horror stories, and there are problems in China. Are they growing too fast? Well, I don't know. They've lifted 250 million people out of poverty in the last 12 years. They're building things. They're building new cities. They're building railroads and power plants in Africa. So this new paradigm that's coming into existence is a threat to the collapsing transatlantic system. That's why the United States is, and by the United States I mean Obama and the main media and literally both parties, is so anti-Putin, because Putin won't play by the rules of a collapsing system. And much of the world now is turning against the United States. Obama was the odd man out at the G20 summit in China. Even the Philippine president called him a son of a bitch and said he's not going to meet with him. So, and the Philippine president said, if we want to talk to the Chinese, we'll talk to the Chinese. We don't need the United States to talk to them for us. So we're seeing an eclipse of American influence because of the failed policies economically, and then the military policies to try and cover up for the failed economic policies. And I can tell you this, the Russians and the Chinese are not going to back away. They saw what the U.S. did to pull off a coup in Brazil to get rid of Dilma Rousseff, but they're not going to drop the BRICS initiative. They're not going to drop the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. They're not going to drop the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. You've got much of the world moving in the direction of the Chinese and the Russians, of infrastructure, of science, of technology, of educating their youth. And in the United States, we're turning our country into a cesspool. So, I think the key challenge for Americans is not to succumb to pessimism, but to actually look at what the Russians and Chinese are doing is they're borrowing a page from our book. The space program in China is directly modeled on what JFK did with NASA. What the Russians and the Chinese are doing with rail goes back to what Lincoln did to unify our continent and build a continental power in the United States based on new technologies, at the time steam engine and steel. So, are we out of new ideas in the United States? Or are our only new ideas how to make digital components smaller and smaller? Or can we recapture the spirit of NASA and the spirit of discovery and the frontier? And that's the challenge for us. And I think that what we're doing here in Europe is we're having a series of conferences where we're bringing people from all over the world to sit down in front of the Germans and the French and say to them, look, why don't you join us? Join us in this enterprise. Drop the policies of geopolitics of London and Wall Street, and let's join hands to defeat terrorism and to rebuild the Middle East, just as an example. So I think that's the fundamental challenge. And what Deutsche Bank brings up is just a perfect example of what happens when you allow the arrogance of speculators to take over and dominate the functions of governments. It's not that government is bad, it's that the bad people are controlling the government.
So how far do you think these bad people in government, I mean, people call them neocons, how far do you think they will go? Do you think they will start war if they don't get their way?
Well, they already have. I mean, what do you think Libya was? Libya was a destruction of a country that was actually succeeding and working with us in the war on terrorism. Look what we did to Iraq. You know, Saddam Hussein was not a great man, but in Iraq you had women as presidents of universities. You had a Christian who was the vice president of the country, Tariq Aziz. Assad protected the minority communities, and we've attacked them. We've said they're not democratic. They don't go along with us. And what we've done is we've destroyed the institutions that were allowing those countries to improve and change. And look, we've been at war now for 15 years in Afghanistan. And look what we did in Ukraine, where we knocked out a democratically elected regime. The same neocons did that and used that as the basis for a war drive to put NATO forces on the border of Russia. So, you asked the question, would we go so far as to going to war? We already have. We're risking World War III right now with the discussions going on between the Pentagon and the Obama administration, with full support of Hillary Clinton, of establishing a no-fly zone in Syria. If the United States goes to do that, are we going to start shooting down Russian jets in order to defend al-Qaeda terrorists in Aleppo? One of the other proposals that came from the head of the Air Force, the U.S. Air Force, is why not just go in and bomb Syrian airplanes on the ground to knock out the Syrian Air Force? Well, under what international law are we doing that? Under what constitutional provision of the U.S. Constitution are we doing that? We're not doing it under any constitutional provision. It's a violation of international law and U.S. law. And so, yeah, they are doing that to protect a bankrupt financial system. And, Dave, I think, I've been doing this for a long time, and I think we're beginning to see more and more people realize that this is not abstract conspiracy theories. And in reality, it's real events controlled by real people doing some really evil things. And the only question is whether the good people, the people who don't agree with these things, will marshal the strength to stand up and say no more. And I think we saw some of that in the presidential campaign. Not enough, and it wasn't clear enough. But we saw some of that. We're seeing it in Europe now. We're seeing Renzi, the Italian prime minister, who's starting to turn against the EU and say, look, we should be working with Russia and China. The prime minister of Portugal, it's a small country, but he went to China today and said, we look to China for the future. The Greeks are doing the same thing. Africa is turning to China. India, which Obama is courting like crazy, is saying, at best, they're going to remain neutral, but they're part of the BRICS. They're working with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So we're losing. And the only thing that we have now is the world's largest and most powerful military. But we're pushing countries to the brink of war, and I mean nuclear war. And so this is where what sometimes people can't make the connection between finance and war. A lot of people say, well, war is a racket. I guess it was Smedley Butler who said that. And, right. They see the financial connections, but they don't really see how completely insane the paradigm is that's being protected by these weapons and these machines of war. So this is a moment of truth for humanity, and I think it's important to make this as clear as possible with people that you're not just talking about saving your pension fund by supporting Glass-Steagall and a Hamiltonian credit policy. You're actually talking about preventing a financial and possibly nuclear Armageddon from taking place.
Harley, I agree with you, and I hope when the time comes, because I don't believe that these individuals will back down. I don't think they'll ever give up on their goal. They've never given up in Syria, where they were always looking to get rid of Assad. They just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And I think if they don't get their way, they're going to push the U.S. and other countries right into World War III, like you said. And I'm hoping at that time that people start to realize what's going on, and there is a movement, just like the TPP, the TTIP, where there were protests around the world where they said,
right.
something, we don't want this. Hopefully, and I hope that people will see this and start to realize that we're heading to war, and people, not just here in the United States, but throughout Europe, because Europe is going to be on the front lines, that they all start to say, something, we're done with this. We cannot do what you want us to do, because this is not going to go well for anybody. And
one of the interesting things that's happening is that there are voices now that are speaking up saying, it's a good thing Putin is the president of Russia, because he has not responded rashly to these provocations. Imagine if you had a drunk like Yeltsin sitting in the Kremlin now, or one of the hardcore right-wing Russian nationalists, because the Russians definitely see this. I mean, they're talking about something that they haven't seen in Ukraine, where you have a government that has openly avowed neo-Nazis in their defense department and their interior ministry, who are calling for the deployment of nuclear weapons to Poland and Ukraine to stop a Russian invasion. And the Russians know they're not about to invade those countries. They don't want to have to deal with the Ukrainian economy.
No.
So you have, thanks to Putin, we haven't had a war yet. And, I think we're beginning to see an appreciation for Putin. I just was talking to some people the other night in Berlin at a meeting, and this one guy just said, well, where are the leaders in the world? And as we were talking, he said, I see one leader, and it's Putin. And some of the people who know him were shocked that he said that, because a year ago he was a big anti-Putin guy. So I think we're seeing around the edges, we're seeing a recognition of the problem. And the question is, will people move to a clarion call for change? And what Lyndon LaRouche has represented for 60 years, 50 years. He just turned 94 last month.
Wow.
And he's still speaking out. He's still active. And what he just said recently, for example, is that the override of Obama's veto on JASTA, the hold the Saudis responsible for 9/11, the important thing on that is the American people spoke out again. They spoke out saying that when we have 3,000 people murdered, we want to know who did it. Don't cover it up. And we saw a similar vote, as you remember, in September 2008, when the Congress was stampeded initially to vote against the bailout. So right. If the American people realize the power they have, if they act, that we can force the Congress to turn against their pocketbooks and their monetary interests controlled by Wall Street, if we mobilize. And that's what we have to do. And I would urge your listeners, go to LaRouchePac.com, study some of the articles we have there on the economy and on the new economic paradigm, because this is something that's real, and it's something that's beckoning to us. And if we have the good sense to move with it, we can avoid the worst consequences that we're otherwise heading towards.
Harley, I want to thank you for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much for coming on.
It's my pleasure. I always enjoy talking with you, Dave, and your listeners are, I find some of their comments on the YouTube site and elsewhere provocative and interesting. And if I can shake them up a little bit, I'm happy to do it.
Thank you very much.